Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to get started now since we only have about an hour and a half. This is the Orange County APA monthly lunch program, Planning for Change in Orange County. This webinar is being recorded and will be available. There is 1.58 ICP CM credits available for this webinar. We will show the CM number and link at the end of this program. My name is Leila Nadal Ibrahim Carver. I'm a planner for CSG Consultants, and I'm the Vice Director of Admin and Finance for this APA section. I'm here with Chris Fortin of Santa Ana Active Streets. You might also know him from his contributions to the Streets blog, California. We also have Elizabeth Hansberg of People for Housing OC to participate during the question and answer segment if housing questions come up. I'm going to hand it over to Chris to introduce our panelists and talk more about our program. First, a reminder that state conference will be virtual this year. Check out the conference webpage for more information. The chat feature has been disabled for today's program. There will be an opportunity for participation during the webinar through the question and answer pop-up window at the bottom of your Zoom app. Add your questions and comments or upvote other questions and comments. We will open the discussion to all panelists and guest speakers during the last about 30 minutes of the program. Please be respectful and patient. This is an important conversation that we will be having today. And without further ado, Chris Fortin.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. So today's presentation is Planning for Change in Orange County. I think this topic is really important to be having right now with the climate we're in, with COVID, with Black Lives Matter protests, and just a lot of reflection on where planning is going at the moment. And so we have gathered 4 speakers today to share a bit of some of the historical and structural racism that has taken place throughout the region and how planning and transportation policy has been really complicit in a lot of these things. So we're going to take a historical look at these issues. We're going to take a look at some of the how these historical issues have actually still resonate still today, and how we're trying to create new strategies for the future. So I guess without further ado, we'll go to our first speaker. So we're joined today with Angela Mooney Darcy. She is the Executive Director and founder of Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples, an Indigenous-led grassroots environmental justice organization dedicated to the building the capacity of Native nations and Indigenous peoples to protect sacred lands, waters, and cultures. She co-founded the United Coalition to Protect Pawnee, an alliance of Achaman people dedicated to the protection of the sacred site Pawnee, and served on the board of the Blas Aguilar Adobe Museum and Achaman Cultural Center for nearly a decade. Angela was also born in her ancestral homeland, whose traditional territories include the area now known as Orange County, and raised in the ancestral homelands of the Osage, Kiowa, and Wichita peoples. She's been working with Native nations, Indigenous peoples, grassroots and nonprofit organizations, artists, educators, and institutions on environmental and cultural justice issues for nearly 20 years. So Angela has a wealth of knowledge. So thank you, Angela, for joining us, and welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Can we put my slide presentation up now? My name's Angela. I'm a Hashiman. Our ancestral territory is what's now known as Orange County. The northern part of Orange County is shared territory with the Tonga people. You can go to the next slide. I like to always start my presentations with this map of, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Of California, because I think often people don't have a real understanding of how diverse and populated California is in terms of Native nations. So I use this map specifically because it was designed by a California Indian traditional basket weaver who's also a graphic designer. You may see other maps that reflect linguistic territories, but this map, there was a real effort to talk directly with the tribal peoples so that their nations could be identified in the language that they use to identify their nations. And so we're the small territory down there in the south, Ahashiman. You can go on to the next slide, please. I also really try to incorporate our traditional place names into presentations I give about land and land use planning, because I think it's really important for folks to understand that what you may know as Santa Ana or Dana Point has other names, and that these other names have been in existence for far longer than the United States has existed, even as a dream in someone's mind. And I think it's also critical for people to understand when we talk about resilience that our people maintain these place names for thousands of years. And the fact that in spite of the state-sponsored attempted genocide and all the hurdles that we faced, we still managed to retain this knowledge means that we as Native people have something to offer that absolutely, if you're talking about equity and land use planning, we always need to be at the table. Next slide, please. This is another important map to show because really when we talk about things like displacement of people and gentrification and incarceration of people of color, we're talking about this map and this timeline. We're not talking about 50 years ago or 100 years ago or even 200 years ago. We're talking about in the 16 and 1700s when the Spanish missions first came through California. And I think it's really important when we talk about land use planning to talk about the doctrine of discovery, which are the papal bulls from the 1400s, which is specifically directed Western European nations to go forth and vanquish, enslave, and murder anyone essentially who was non-white and non-Christian. That's what justified the partitioning of Africa. That's what justified colonization throughout the Americas. And this legacy is very much alive and well today in the erasure of Native people in my own homeland. When you look at this map, it coincides with the list of tribal nations in California that are not federally recognized and that are landless. And it's absolutely no mistake that some of the most valuable and beautiful and well-resourced parts of California are the areas where the government doesn't recognize the legitimacy of tribal land, tribal jurisdiction over our homeland. Next slide, please. I want to talk a minute about climate colonialism because, again, you know, folks talk about climate change and climate disruption and the impending climate disaster. I think it's important for people to understand that for those folks that have been here since the beginning of time, according to our stories, and for at least 10,000 years, according to archaeological records, that climate disaster happened at the point of contact. What took over 300 years to accomplish in terms of ecological devastation in Mexico took the span of a single lifetime, 70 years in California. And that coincides directly with that path of doctrine of discovery and the establishment of the mission. So we as California Native people have been dealing with massive and violent ecological disruption of our homelands for several hundred years. Next slide, please. And, you know, again, with land acknowledgement, I have a reflection on this because I think it's something that's become a lot more popular now. And I say that land acknowledgement is important. And again, this is my personal opinion, but for me personally, I would rather people not do a land acknowledgement if they haven't also done the work to involve actual people from those communities to be a part of the gatherings. And that's why I use these pictures. The picture on the left is of the Santa Monica Pier, and these are all Tongva people. And I like to include it to remind folks that we as Native people don't just exist in the past. We have families and children who we want to, you know, carry on our cultures. The picture on the right is Ahashiman folks. Charles Sepulveda is a tribal scholar. Joyce Stanfield Perry is one of my mentors, and she's our cultural resource monitor. But I just wanted to contemporize land acknowledgement and just say to folks, if you're going to do land acknowledgement, I encourage you to reflect deeply on what your actual engagement is with those Native nations who you're acknowledging. And if you're not currently engaging them, figure out how you can do better, because we maintain that involving tribal nations is absolutely an essential component of any equitable land use policy. Next slide. And why is it important to engage with California tribes? There's over 150 Native American tribes with ancestral homelands in what's now known as California. Native nations are sovereign governments with whom the local governments and state governments have a duty to consult. And so we are not stakeholders in any planning process. We are citizens of sovereign nations to whom a government-to-government relationship exists. Next slide, please. In terms of why it's important to support Native American protection of sacred places as an equity issue in land use planning, the picture on the left is of the 241 toll road site. Many of you may have heard of that. Many people are probably familiar with Trestles Beach and how important it was to surfers. Less well known is the fact that that's a 10,000-year-old village site and burial ground for Hashman people. And the tribe was very actively involved in opposing that toll road. We were ultimately victorious, but it was a real challenge to be heard. Even amongst environmental allies, it was very challenging to get people to listen to and respect our story and give us the space to tell that of our own accord. On the right is a picture in San Juan Capistrano of the area known as the village of Putitum. And many of you may have heard that site referenced as a piece of a Hashman, not land return, but a space that's city-owned, open space that will actually reflect the input and the thoughts and desires of the Hashman people. Next slide. And this is just an overview of some of the state tribal consultation laws. You have AB 52, which applies to CEQA projects. You have Coastal Commission and State Lands Commission both adopting tribal consultation and EJ policies. And then SB 18 is the state tribal consultation bill. And next slide, please. So these next slides this slide is really important. Sacred Places Institute engaged in a year-long tribal community engagement process with the Hashman and Tongva folks who lived within the Santa Ana watershed. And though it was specific to the Santa Ana River, this quote about what meaningful involvement means to tribes, I think is applicable for all land use projects. It means being involved at all levels. A genuine collaboration and a seat at the table in the process from the very beginning. We have the experts and professionals and academic scholars that are more than qualified to respond to these things. So tribal people have spoken and they want to be involved at every step of the way in land use planning. Next slide. And these are some specific things, again, that were applicable to the river, but I think that they translate based on my experience working with different tribal folks over the past 20 years. Indigenize the place names. Include the indigenous place names whenever possible in representations of the rivers or the places. Tribal territory should be visibly demonstrated on all maps and associated materials. You should recognize tribes as full partners in ideas and programs, especially related to stewardship. Access is crucial. Prioritize spaces for tribal, cultural, and ceremonial use within and along the river and in other open spaces. Space and parks should consider and prioritize multiple types of access, including spaces where tribal community members can gather clean, safe, pesticide-free plant materials without fear of harassment from private security, local homeowners, or police. And I just want to reflect on that for a minute to say that consider what it means to live within your own homeland where your people have been since the beginning of time, and to not even be able to access essential plant medicines for ceremony for fear of harassment from police or folks who now own, quote unquote, own homes in what is your ancestral homeland. Next slide, please. And then we can just go through these quickly because I'm sure I'm about out of time, but I just wanted to include the different actual excerpts from Coastal Commission and State Lands Commission, environmental justice and tribal consultation policies, because I thought it would be important for folks to be able to see how different state agencies are working to be more accountable to and representative of tribal needs. Next slide, please. And then as a final reflection, I encourage you to review Dr. Charles Sepulveda's article, Our Sacred Waters, Theorizing Kuyum as a Decolonial Possibility. Kuyum is the Tongva word for guest. And in his article, Charlie posits that one of the most fundamental things anyone from a settler society can do our homelands today is to reflect on the question, how are you being a good guest in Tonga and Ahashiman homelands? And so I would just suggest for planners moving forward and who are interested in equity in land use planning, we're asked that question often and always. How are you working to be a good guest on tribal homelands? And with that, I'll say thank you, and I look forward to engaging with folks during the Q&A later.
Thank you, Angela. So before we start with our next speaker, I'm just going to make a quick announcement in Spanish that we have interpretation. So para todas las personas que están que necesitan interpretación en español, está disponible abajo de la página donde está el botón interpretación o interpretation, y después cuando hacen un clic después de Spanish, y va a escuchar a alguna persona que está hablando en español para ayudarte. So, es una imagen de un globo. Está abajo de la página. Si tienes todavía una pregunta, sí, vamos a tratar de ayudar. Okay. So on to our next speaker. So Manny Escamilla is a Santa Ana historian. He is a board member of the Macara Art Center, the Mexican American Heritage and Cultural Center of OC, and part of the director circle with Cal State's Fullerton's Grand Central Arts Center. He was elected to the Orange County Democratic Central Committee for the 69th Assembly District and appointed to as an Arts and Culture Commissioner for the City of Santa Ana. He was raised in Santa Ana, spent his youth at the McFadden Library and Jerome Center. After graduating from Santa Ana Unified School District, he went on to UC Berkeley and received 2 master's degrees from UCLA. He began working for the Santa Ana Public Library in 2004. As part of the White House award-winning Teen Space program, he spent the 14 years working for the City of Santa Ana as an urban planner, librarian, and historian. In 2015, he was recognized by Library Journal for his work with the Teen Community Historian program to collect, preserve, and share local history. So he has a wealth of knowledge in history. If you've ever checked out some of his presentations around land use, around Santa Ana history, just in our streets, his presentation on parking lot history is wonderful. But today he will be talking about housing and the legacy of housing discrimination and how that's shaped our landscape in Orange County and how it still perpetuates today. So without further ado, Manny, take it away.
Cool. Well, thank you for that, Chris. All right, so for everyone out there, I definitely want to preface this by saying that I am definitely a kind of Santa Ana historian, and I do focus that as kind of the center of my research. But with the county being the region that it is, you kind of get a lot of understanding as far as the regional dynamics that were at play. That kind of leads to this particular scenario that we're seeing in front of us here with the New York Times in 1996, basically talking about Santa Ana being the kind of new face of California and a place where Latinos actually have political power and representation. However, again, kind of the picture that was chosen to kind of represent Santa Ana and California at the national level, and then the Latinoization of the United States, is one that actually is born from a series of struggle and actually around topics of land use very specifically. So this particular community, essentially, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Logan Barrio, is an old barrio that was actually within the incorporated boundaries of the city. It is an area that was then zoned industrial due to its proximity to rail lines and other kind of modes of regional transportation, and was basically slated by the city and written off as an area that needed to be industrialized, redeveloped, bought off, and a community that was basically destroyed. So here in this particular narrative that we're kind of going to go through, we're going to see a series of planning decisions that were made that impacted a particular neighborhood that was actually able to resist those plans from on top and to try to develop their own particular identity. So, without further ado, me being the historian that I am, I started off at least looking at this topic by going through the census records, and I figured, well, let's just start at the beginning and like let's take a look at some of this fun stuff. So, I have one degree in urban planning and one degree in archives, and I spend my time kind of trying to figure out a balance between both worlds. And with this particular document, I found it very kind of interesting to go through because you can actually see that the town founder William Spurgeon as a merchant being counted in the census. You look at where he's from, you see how much kind of the value of his estate is, how much property he has, and some of the features very prominently in our narrative here locally. It's $900 is the value of his estate. Over here, we have a man by the name of Francisco Rodriguez with a state that's worth $9,000 at the time. So someone who definitely was a much larger landowner, played a more important role in the region. Was a large heir for the Spanish land system that did take land away from the indigenous population, but is basically a different center of power that you kind of see here in Orange County in the mid 1800s. But this person is not necessarily included in any of our histories. So again, just kind of looking at the variety of Latin and Hispanic last names that you see in these early census records, you kind of get an early history that was basically left out of our records. And this kind of continued on with the story of Logan. So the plans that we have, talking about what was going on in this community, they usually see it as it was seen as a low-income community, an area that had declining property values, places that basically were catering to minorities. Like, you'll see this in the planning documents over and over. But there wasn't really kind of a talk about the strength of the cultural life that was there. So we were lucky enough when I was working at the Santa Ana Public Library to get a collection of about 2,000 photographs from a family who just kind of documented everyday life in the Logan Barrio. And through these, you can kind of see like the wealth of, how people are actually happy. This is pretty much right in the center of Logan, a kid kind of growing up, and you'd say like the idealized, almost kind of 1950s America in this weird way, but still facing a set of challenges and patterns of discrimination that he was, this child was born into. And one of the most prevalent ones was the segregation of school children, right? So this was actually from the segregated school down at the Logan Barrio. So that building was built in 1929, was later demolished, and I think is currently a tow truck operation, if I'm correct on that. And these were basically institutions that were placed within communities that were then to serve them. And we kind of, I think, see two major themes emerge from kind of a set of patterns. The first theme being that most of these kind of structural inequalities that were baked into the system are really kind of the legacy in our status quo. And I think by looking at the documentation of the various plans impacting Logan specifically as it relates to industrial land use policy and reinvestment, you see that technical language, best practices, quote unquote, from the planning profession was basically used to justify a structural inequality. And we'll see this in various formats. And that, I think as part of the kind of conversation that I had with other panelists before we started this, there's this idea that, Orange County broke away in order to be away from Los Angeles that was, too multicultural and too large. And there is some truth to that. It's basically with the white flight kind of coming into the county during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But it was a bit more of a tax revolt in some ways. And, if we want to go back to the founding of the county, it's much more based around the idea of land speculation and how long it took to develop any kind of deal. So anytime you wanted to do a real estate transaction, it basically took you 2 days to get up to Los Angeles and to back down, rather than being able to go to a courthouse really close by. But there was an embedded sense of racialization from the county and a need to want to, kind of separate oneself from the wider kind of diversifying urban core of Los Angeles. And I think this is exemplified in an image that was kind of widely shared in the 1950s. Right here, those are widely shared in the 1950s, where we basically see this image that was printed. I believe this is in the orange. Let's see, the Costa Mesa Globe. So this is down from Costa Mesa, and then was reprinted in the local industrial news letter that was going out to all the business owners. And to me, this is basically LA and Orange County trying to separate oneself. I'm not very easily offended, but I was particularly offended when I saw this cartoon for the first time. And there was that general attitude, at least, that I pick up on, at least in the historic narrative. And I think that the sense of otherness and kind of who you're planning for was embedded in even planning documents up to the 1970s. And to that end, I point to this document. Forgive the blurriness, but this was done pre-COVID, just for personal notes, and now I can't get back into the archive. But the Central Santa Ana Plan from 1977, basically is looking at what you do with Central Santa Ana as it's trying to compete with all these emerging South County cities. And, I'm hoping actually that this is kind of blurry for you, because I don't want you to be able to read this, but, these are identifications of different problem areas that were looked at as the downtown plan was being developed. And again, we see, an area here, all kinds of, different activities. And then, the end results are, these are going to be the focus areas. Over here in Flower West, Garfield, this is where the Logan neighborhood is at. And again, problems all throughout the urban core, something going on over here. But these are the areas that are going to be focused on. And when you zoom in on it, well, the areas that are going to be focused on are, let's see over here on the right, illegals generally found in this area, high transit population, primarily minority, crime associated with this area. Okay. Over here in the center, in the area that wasn't being targeted or wasn't seen as a priority area for redevelopment, several bars, gang activity, fights, winos and prostitutes, and again, just poor vehicular circulation. But this area was not targeted for any form of kind of redevelopment, was not seen as a priority area, but systematically, any of the areas that had large minority populations in the downtown in this 1977 plan were essentially targeted by the redevelopment agency as like, okay, there's something that we need to do here. So there's a very specific spatial nexus that happens here as it relates to planning documents. And again, just to kind of put this into further context, the current plan that the city is basically operating under, like its last comprehensive update to the general plan was roughly, I believe, like 1986, 88. So this document that you're seeing here was only about 10 to 11 years prior from that. So it's not like there was going to be a giant transition, right? So this is a kind of a systemic issue that there's a reason why I guess so many folks are kind of hesitant to be friendly with planners, right? It's not something that we kind of admit maybe as a profession, is that, we are basically an arm of the state, right? We have state police power that basically grants us the right to enforce a municipality's will on residents. And oftentimes that power was used, again, for the most powerful. These cities are places where that happens. And this, again, you don't want to definitely read it, but just to kind of give an example here, Garfield, one of those neighborhoods that was set as a priority, it was seen as so bad that there wasn't anything that the redevelopment agency was going to be able to do. So the recommendation was to don't do anything, let the commercial and industrial areas kind of take over it, and then the neighborhood will go away eventually on its own, so that we don't want to reinvest in these neighborhoods. And that's a very specific recommendation. Same thing with the Logan neighborhood. Basically this is prime industrial land, and we really should be used as that. And we want to make sure this residential liability is, it'll just go away. So we don't recommend investing in this at all. So again, these are kind of the types of decisions that were being made, and it led to a reaction, right? So this was, the reason why Logan is still around was that folks like, oh my God, Sam Romero here. He's going to yell at me for forgetting his name. So folks like Sam Romero got together and organized and actually opposed City Hall. And, this is something you don't really would get in most kind of mainstream papers. But if you read the Chicano papers that were around at the time, covered this issue a lot more heavily. And, eventually they got to the planning board. They were able to kind of put up signs. They were able to get the city council and a lot of kind of more mainstream attention. So this appeared in the LA Times, where they were able to finally kind of rezone their own residential neighborhood as residential. Because again, one of the things that you see is it wasn't necessarily formal redlining, right? There was never a HOLIC map that was created for the County of Orange. It kind of came too late. It was already a suburb. But what you did see were kind of like a shadow banning effect, right? Where you zone an area industrial, it becomes legal non-conforming, then it becomes almost impossible for the resident there to actually get a loan from a bank to be able to improve or expand or do anything to their home. So the home value deteriorates because you're not able to reinvest any of that equity back into the house, into the structure itself. So, this is a very big fight that they had. And after all that, this is all that they were really able to save, right? So this is the Logan neighborhood. Most of the industrial intrusion has already occurred. The 5 freeway has already kind of clipped it over here on this end, a rail line going right through it. They were able to prevent a major arterial running right through the middle that would have completely destroyed the community. But, this is a story I'm able to tell you because they fought back. There's another community immediately to the south, which I only learned again through those early census records that I had no idea as a Santa Ana historian was there as an early Mexican barrio. The only way that I knew about it was seeing a bunch of Latin and Spanish last names in and around this area that has now basically been completely industrialized. So that's a link that has been severed. And again, as I'm trying to kind of study the area and figure out the history of its land use patterns, this is a link that I'm trying to bring back and trying to figure out how to connect. But it's a story that, again, I'm, as someone who's, I would say, well versed in these local issues, never saw and never learned about. So these stories are kind of around us. I don't know how much these apply to other Orange County contexts, but I'm sure that we can find different parallels. And with this, the other thing that we kind of see in this map is that another portion over here was recently widened. So this is the street of Grand, which was widened, and then a couple of homes were basically demolished, or homes and commercial properties were demolished and purchased here. And that kind of leads us into the other major form of displacement that Peter is going to be talking about, which is about road widenings and the impacts of the master plan of arterial highways. So with that, seize my time and give it back to the host. Thank you.
Thank you, Manny. Appreciate that that context. So next up, we have Peter. He's Peter Garcia. He's a member of Santa Ana Active Streets. He'll be talking today about the Master Plan of Arterial Highways, like Manny mentioned, but also Measure M, also known as OC Go. Peter, he actually did a lot of work around Measure M MPAH. He actually did his master thesis as a client who working with actually Latino Health Access and coordinating with them to develop this research around using critical race theory to study the pedestrian crash distribution in Orange County. But more importantly, he sought to find the policy barriers to implementing pedestrian and safety improvements and provided policy recommendations to overcome these barriers. And as a representative of SAS, I'm also, as Leila mentioned, I'm also a member of SAS. So just got to plug SAS real quickly. SAS, Santa Ana Active Streets, we're a Santa Ana-based coalition that works to promote, advocate for active transportation in the city. And also that means sometimes getting involved in the county as well too. But we're also very intersectional. So anything around active transportation, whether it's bike and pedestrian issues, we get involved with land use issues, we get involved in transit issues, but then we also get on the ground and try to also educate folks on better safety habits and safety practices as well too, and working with community members. But ultimately, we're a community engagement organization, and we are constantly dialoguing and making sure that any of our work is community led. So Peter will be, like I said, talking about Measure M MPH, and I guess you can take it away.
Nobody ever said that Zoom's interface was ever user-friendly. Hi, my name is Peter, and today I'm going to cover systemic racism. and mobility in Orange County, specifically how Measure M2 and Master Plan of Arterial Highways perpetuate these racial and class inequities that we've discussed so far. So before we begin, some jargon. The Master Plan of Arterial Highways, or MPA, MPAH, is a regional network of arterial streets that the OCTA administrates and regulates through its many codes and guidance on the MPA. Although the OCTA doesn't have jurisdiction over arterials, even though they do set design guidelines, that jurisdiction still falls under cities. However, the OCTA has significant influence over the street design of these arterials, even if they do fall under city control, because MPA is tied to Measure M and Measure M2. Measure M, which is a sales tax that was voted in '91 and has since expired, and Measure M2 are local option sales taxes that county voters voted in with the aim to provide major capital investments to relieve traffic congestion, a fool's errand essentially. So the significance behind these two is that these two are connected. For your city to receive M2 or M funds, your city has to comply with this. Your city circulation element has to comply with MPA. Now, this is bad for numerous reasons I'll explain later. And it is a unique situation to Orange County. LA Metro's Measure M doesn't have these kind of restrictions. Riverside County's Measure A doesn't have these kinds of restrictions. So this is essentially a unique thing to Orange County. In some terms, before we begin, systemic racism, if we boil it down, can be understood as not racism towards individuals, but rather institutions and policies that adversely affect non-white racialized groups, essentially discrimination against groups as a whole rather than to individuals. And we can understand classism typically as policies or institutions that discriminate against the poor, typically. So, as an introduction, what has systemic racism look like in transportation planning and engineering? It's typically tied to, as Manny pointed this out, urban renewal. Here, Eric Avila at UCLA argues that in 1950s Los Angeles, the city followed the recommendations of the Urban Land Institute to coordinate highway construction with slum clearance. Now, of course, when we hear slum clearance or blight removal, we have to read it as people of color removal. And this had the consequence, as Avila continues, that throughout the post-war period, many of LA's multicultural communities succumbed to freeway construction. And that's why you see these massive highway projects in East LA and South LA, but highways that cover or cross through affluent or wide areas only exist in the imagination. And between these three, East LA, South LA, and Beverly Hills, I'll leave you to make your own conclusions as to why the Beverly Hills Freeway doesn't exist. And now you might say, yeah, that's LA. We didn't have redlining. I mean, Manny's a smart dude, and he just said that. We didn't really have slum clearance, so Manny covered that. And we didn't really have urban renewal in Orange County. I wish that were the case, but here we have aerial imagery of Bristol Street from the early 2000s to 2018. And you can see the process of homes being demolished to widen Bristol Street, with final completion here in 2018, with just empty parcels laying around. And one of the prime motivations for widening Bristol was to turn Bristol from one of the most blighted streets in all of Orange County into the best looking and best functioning street in the county. This was in 1993. The city was in hot water. The city wasn't its Latino population wasn't as pronounced as it is today. But there were several lawsuits against the city because some Latino residents had things to say, right? Bristol is and was and is a predominantly Latino corridor of Latino homeownership and Latino commercial activity. And some of the lawsuits ask the city, well, if the aim is to remove blight, then why are you removing non-blighted structures, right? And again, we have to interpret this as blight being, there are people of color who live here. In Orange County's case, or in Santa Ana, it's Latinos. Now, with that covered, onto our main topic, how measures M and M2 and the Master Plan of Arterial Highways, which I'll refer to as MPA from now on, perpetuate inequity. And I'm going to cover it in 3 different sections. The first one being the wallet, which covers economic inequity and highway robbery. The second being the home, which covers displacement and dispossession. And the third one being the body, which covers trauma and death. So yeah, we'll begin with the wallet. As I mentioned before, Measure M and Measure M2 are sales taxes, and by their nature, sales taxes are intrinsically regressive. They adversely affect the poor, they disproportionately burden the poor more than the affluent. And here we have Schweitzer, who's at USC, and Taylor at UCLA saying this about Measure M. From a regional planning perspective, funding freeway capacity with a sales tax is a pro-auto, pro-driving policy that taxes all residents, the rich, and disproportionately the poor, to provide benefits to a smaller group of drivers and their passengers. That was a good time to revisit the distribution chart for OCGO, which is the modern iteration of Measure M. Isn't that a little bit curious? And they go on to say that the entire Measure M program redistributes an estimated $26 million from low-income residents to the more affluent. And this is where we see the equity issues arise, right? You have a sales tax system that is essentially creating this environment where the poor are subsidizing infrastructure that disproportionately benefits the affluent. And this is more pronounced when you look at how transit funding in Measure M2 is allocated. It primarily focuses on capital projects for Metrolink's Orange County line. Yeah, there are some capital investments for electric buses, but let's be real, that's because it's a state mandate rather than a meaningful investment for bus riders. And you see these equity issues arise when you compare the median household income for the Orange County line, the Metrolink line, and OC bus riders. The Orange County line consistently is the most affluent line in the whole Metrolink system. I don't want to deny that the poor don't use the Orange County line. I'm not saying that we should dismantle it because it benefits the affluent. What I'm saying is that its ridership skews dramatically towards the affluent. And when you contrast that with the median household income of bus riders, who according to the OCTA in 2015 make $20,000 annually or less, right? You see where these disparities in investments are within this tax system, in the capital projects that are invested in. Now, I want to argue that there are other burdens and costs attributed to Measure M and MPA other than monetary and financial costs. So what I'm going to argue is that it also costs where people live. It costs them their home. As many of you may know, space in Orange County is finite. It's not infinite. We're not in the void. But I must remind you that to receive Measure M2 funds, cities have to comply with MPA regulations, the regulations that the OCTA have set. And this usually means widening underbuilt arterials, underbuilt being something that the OCTA categorizes. But for cities that are fully developed, like Santa Ana, Anaheim, Garden Grove, these older cities that are fully built out, they lack space. And to make space, they have to use eminent domain to widen the streets. And that means clearing homes. So we'll look at Bristol and Warner Avenue. Both are in Santa Ana as many case studies. I'm using these two because there is no central EIR collection system in Orange County. We work with the data that we have available. So again, I'm bringing you back to Bristol. This was from 2000 to 2018. According to its environmental impact report, there were, I'm going to cover phases 3A and 4. In total, these two phases displaced 173 residents. This is not counting the widening prior to the 90s. The environmental impact report showed that most residents were either Latino or Vietnamese descent. Interviews were mostly conducted in non-English. In the interviews, residents who were set to be displaced said that they wanted to stay because they had access to public schools, to jobs, to public transit, and to local resources. Now, I want to emphasize the power associated with using roadway widening to clear blight. It wasn't lost on some, and you can kind of see this coordinated effort between private citizen and jurisdiction. Here we have a quote from the Washington Square Neighborhood Association November 2013 newsletter, where they asked the city that from Civic Center to 17th, that we demolish and remove unsightly, unkempt residential buildings. Now, these modest homes did fall under the Washington Square boundary, but you start asking yourself these questions, right? Who has the power to dispossess? Who has the power to take advantage of these policies to dispossess of your neighbor? Do these homeowners have the same political power as Washington Square Neighborhood Association to remain? Does their power compare to a cabal of homeowners whose sole motivation in organizing is to inflate their property values? Who has the power to do this? And we see the same narrative in Warner. The project is slated to displace 155 residents if it hasn't already. Like in Bristol, you have a distorted relationship where the poor are paying disproportionately a sales tax that is funding their own displacement and dispossession. And again, same narrative. The interviews showed that residents want to remain to retain access to public transit, to schools, to jobs, to local resources. They were mostly Latino, and they were mostly primary Spanish speaking at home. I hope you've all started to find that there's a pattern here, right? Like, and again, like I've been speaking here in the abstract, I've been saying numbers, residents displaced, and what have you. But we have to remember that our policy affects real life people. And here's two of them. This is Robert and Lupa Fernandez in the home that they've lived for in the past 60 years in Santa Ana. Lupa tells the OC Register, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? I'm too old to start over again. Lupa and Robert were 81 at the time of this interview. I'm not entirely sure what's happened to them yet. Mauro Vega says, my daughter's baby began walking along here. What now? And again, I ask you to contrast this with the claim that Washington Square Neighborhood Association made and start asking yourself not only who has the power to dispossess, but who has the power to remain? Who has the power and access to institutional knowledge to say, to go to your council member and say, hey, council member Garcia, I want you to go to the OCTA. I want you to go over there. I want you to set up a negotiation so that we can reclassify Warner so that we're not displaced and that you can still remain in compliance with Measure M2 or with the MPA and still receive Measure M2. Who has the institutional knowledge here to do that? If there are any representatives here or people who work in Orange County, do you know that you can negotiate to reclassify arterials? Is that knowledge shared? And lastly, the body. One justification, one reason that behind arterial widenings is to improve pedestrian safety. That's simply not the case. Arterials are actually the most dangerous environment for pedestrians, and we'll look at 2013 and 2017 data for that. We'll see that, of course, a disproportionate amount of pedestrian crashes and deaths happen on MPOS streets. And for cities that are invested in active transportation or improving their pedestrian safety, cyclist safety, or what have you, you have this dilemma. You defy the MPA and you make streets safer, but you potentially lose millions of dollars for capital projects and potentially bankrupt your city. Or you keep complying with MPA, receive M2 dollars, but create a more hostile environment for your most marginalized residents. And again, following the pattern, pedestrian crashes disproportionately affect OC's Latino community. Here we have a map of the county and MPA streets outlined, or arterial streets outlined in MPA. Here we have pedestrian crashes in the county from 2013 to 2017. Notice the disparities, notice where they're happening, notice where the hotspots are, notice where the clusters are. And here is a map of pedestrian deaths, same thing. Where are they falling? Are they falling on arterial streets? Now, although arterial streets under MPA constitute a small minority of roadway mileage, of total roadway mileage in the county at 18%, you see that 75% of pedestrian crashes are occurring on arterial streets. Right? This small little slice is certainly much bigger when it comes to pedestrian crashes. And 83% of pedestrian deaths happen on arterial streets. And when you look at the available demographic data of who are the pedestrian victims, although Latinos are 34% of the county's population, they make up 45% of the pedestrian crash victims, and they make up 41% of pedestrian deaths, an overrepresentation in traffic violence. This is systemic racism essentially in OCTA's flagship transportation policy. And now maybe one city has noticed that Measure M2 and then pose a significant barrier to pedestrian safety. And as a transportation nerd in Orange County, I think this is quite a bold statement to say that with a focus on safety, many of the recommendations in the Safe Mobility Plan are not consistent with MPA. Now, the Safe Mobility Plan being, out of the 34 cities in Orange County, being the only meaningful Vision Zero program in Orange County, which they can't meaningfully address without having to jump these hurdles that the OCTA is putting on them. Now, can we move forward? And I'm almost finishing up here. Other transit agencies, other bodies have made this move towards transportation equity, including our own little golden city of Santa Ana. But we can't really say the same about our county leadership, right? Which is unfortunate, because the ones who are setting these policies that are dangerous for our most marginalized and vulnerable groups are at the county level. So let's all bring it back together. I hope we all enjoyed deconstructing these two policies and how they affect the poor and the people of color living in the county, as well as exploring the power disparities that these policies reinforce. We have to ask ourselves, yeah, who has the power? Who has the power to dispossess? Who has the power to remain? Whose safety are we valuing? Whose lives are we valuing? Whose mobility are we prioritizing? And yes, we should aim for more representation and planning. But if this whole panel here, which are amazing people, staged a coup at the OCTA board, but still practice these same policies, the representation doesn't mean much because now we have a different set of people reinforcing the white supremacy embedded in these policies. So we have to cultivate our own power to change these things and to dismantle the white supremacy that's embedded in these policies. So, to that extent, that means understanding that MPA is a living fossil. It perpetuates the systemic racism of 50s transportation planning. And we have to understand that Measure M2 is a classist finance policy that serves as a resource transfer from the poor to the rich. And resource here meaning money, meaning our homes, and the bodies that we hold sacred to ourselves. And I'm all out of breath. If you'd like to kind of keep talking about this, you can reach me at LinkedIn and my email or my Twitter handle down there below and continue the conversation. But that's about it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I had some technical difficulties, but I know you've spoken a lot on Measure M with us and shared a lot. And so there's wealth of knowledge. So anybody that wants to reach out more to learn more, kind of the implications of the pedestrian impacts, just honestly, the wall of the body. I forget the last one, I'm sorry. But so moving on, actually real quick too, we're going to be starting our Q&A section in a second. So if anybody has any submit prior to the end of this session, please send them our way, and we'll start asking questions in it. Next up, we have Marlon, Regisford. He is a planner at Caltrans. He also is a member of OC APA. He specialized in active transportation planning, CEQA, environmental analysis, transportation demand management, administration, travel, forecasting, freight planning, as well as land use planning. He has considerable experience in the preparation, review, corridor.
Sorry to interrupt you, Chris. Just your audio is cutting in and out. I don't know if Marlon can just introduce himself because I think I lost all of that.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I won't say too much. Hopefully you can hear me as well, but thanks, Chris. I appreciate the intro. I'll go ahead and share my screen if you can see it. And we'll go from there. All right, let me pull up my slide here. So I just want to make sure that we put this in the frame of transportation before we start our overall discussion. But briefly, I'll just say that as a disclaimer, I do work for Caltrans, and the thoughts that I'm sharing today are my own thoughts and not necessarily of my employer. So just putting that one out there. We'll go ahead and get started. So I want to frame this, and Peter and Angela and Manny had some great discussions about how transportation affected Santa Ana and affected our region as a whole. But I just want to frame this in the regional perspective in terms of transportation, in terms of freeways. So as you can see here, there was a lot of freeway expansion that happened over the past several decades. And I'm speaking more in a sense of the last 50 years or so, or 60. Basically, you see that in Orange County, most of the freeway expansion happened in the 1950s era, moving all the way into the 1970s. So that was the biggest area where we had freeway expansion. And as you see, there's different phases for each freeway. The only one that you see there is State Route 91 that doesn't have a time frame, because that freeway or that highway has been pretty much in development almost every decade since it's been a basically a dirt road. So, but every other roadway, as you can see, I-5, 55, 22, 405, 90, 57, all of those have been developed in a very certain area of time. And as you can probably imagine, this was a time period in which there were a couple of things happening. There was a movement away from LA County, folks moving into newer suburban areas of Orange County as housing was developed and other types of facilities. This coincided with what many called the white flight era, where folks have moved out of LA County to avoid the, so to speak, the diversification of the LA area. And so the freeway movement actually was around the same time where military was expanding their bases all across the country, and they needed a way, when I say they, I mean the military needed a way to transport things from base to base. And so the interstate freeway system was something that was developed on a federal level in terms of policy. And California was a state that followed through also with that policy. But as a region, there were many impacts that were associated with that freeway expansion. And so there was a lot of money given for this purpose, but it also served other purposes, some of which Peter and Manny have mentioned. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide here. And I just want to preface this slide by saying, you know, this is a snapshot of what this freeway displacement was in Southern California. This is not an official map, but all of these areas were documented by media and such as being areas where there was displacement occurring. As you can see, there was many displacement occurring in LA County, in areas that coincidentally are areas that did not have the political power to fight displacement compared to other areas. And I know Angela had mentioned earlier the 241 toll road. That's an area where the community was able to fight against freeway expansion. That's in more recent times, but in previous times, as I believe Peter mentioned this, there was the proposed Hollywood freeway that went through Beverly Hills. That one was not built. You can probably understand why. I'll leave that up to your interpretation, but there were other areas across Southern California that weren't so fortunate in being able to impact or prevent the impacts to their community of freeway construction. Now, as you can see in Orange County here, there's two distinct areas that were noted by media as having some displacement impacts in previous decades, and that is in the area of Old Town Placentia and virtually the main portion of Santa Ana through I-5. And going back again, touching on some of the previous presentations, it really had an effect on the land uses in that area of where the freeway was constructed. And the community that was there before was primarily residential, and they were not able to be able to manage with the construction of these highways. So I just want to leave you with the thought that freeway transportation in general, it's known and is thought about as a positive for people's quality of life, a tool for people to get around, for people to get from point A to point B and be productive throughout their day. But there's a flip side to the coin for transportation, and this just not just go for highways. I know I'm focusing a lot on the freeway displacement here, but this goes for all modes of transportation. There is a positive and a negative, and I just want to share that with folks as we frame this discussion. So moving on to something that's very interesting in Orange County history is the Centerline Rail that was proposed by OCTA in the late 80s. And this was a system that, and I know Peter Manny had also talked about Bristol. I know, yeah, Peter talked about that a lot, but this was planned to go from the Santa Ana train station to the Bristol corridor and down all the way to John Wayne Airport, and even an alternative towards the Irvine train station. So this was proposed in the late 1990s, basically. And there's a little timeline that you see here on the right-hand side where Orange County residents passed Measure M. This was in 1990, and I could talk a whole lot more about this, but this was the beginning of Orange County's self-help tax, so their transportation tax. And many of our urban areas in California have a self-help county tax where they levy a sales tax to fund transportation measures that they choose as a county. And when I say that they choose, usually it's the Board of Supervisors who make the final decision on what projects are included in a sales tax measure plan. So Orange County, they passed this measure in 1990, and there was a rail master plan done in 94. And then after that, this route was identified as having potential to move riders and, you know, improve transportation across the county. And at this time of history, Orange County was starting to feel the impacts of heavy freeway expansion, where congestion was a real serious thing and people couldn't really enjoy their quality of lives as needed. And also, there was a severe lack of connectivity between South County and Central Orange County. So as you see the proposed rail map here, that was what the rail planners had proposed originally. And probably, as you can imagine, there was some pushback regarding this center line proposal. And earlier than 2001, as you see on the timeline, but Irvine, Costa Mesa, and Santa Ana proposed to be part of that system. It ended up being that Irvine and Costa Mesa ended up pulling out of that proposal because they had some disagreement within their community, their residents, as well as their elected officials in terms of how that routing went through their community. And eventually this proposal was killed. It was shot down by the OC Board of Supervisors, which basically comprised of the OCTA board. So, you know, the elected officials weren't comfortable with what the community was voicing. And, you know, the typical impacts that you would hear with rail development, oh, you have, you know, unwanted populations coming through, or folks that riffraff, and visual impacts to our community. And, you know, the aesthetics aren't what we like to see, people looking in our backyards, or people loitering or hanging out where they're not supposed to be. All the typical excuses that you would hear from NIMBYs is what you heard from the center line. And so that really affected the Board of Supervisors and caused them to take this center line off of the drawing board, basically. So as you can see, in 2003, OCTA board and City of Irvine revised the route in Irvine. There's another environmental impact report that was released. Federal government even approved the system, but construction never began, and the center line never opened in 2009. So as you probably know, we're still talking about rail in Orange County being constructed. But I'll move on. So there's another part of the center line rail project that I want to really understand, at least for folks on the call today. But there were four alternatives basically, but two of them were elevated, two of them were at grade. All four of those alternatives were shot down by the board of directors. So it didn't matter whether the rail went above or at grade or below, it just wasn't going to happen. So it was eventually replaced by OCTA Project V, which is Go Local funding. I think that's been rebranded already. Peter mentioned OC Go, but that OC Go is the predecessor, the rename of Measure M. So inside Measure M, OCTA Project V is something that was a legacy of the OCTA centerline development. And what it gave was the ability for all local jurisdictions to utilize the funds that were originally intended for centerline rail and use them for their own local circulators. So that completely eliminated the connectivity aspect of the rail system and pretty much allowed every community to do their own thing, which, you know, is a very typical Orange County thing. However, it doesn't really serve the greater transportation purpose that everybody, you know, originally thought would have happened. So, but there are things that came out of it, such as the Irvine Shuttle, Laguna Beach Shuttle, the Anaheim, the Art Shuttle. There's a lot of local shuttles that came out of and are still coming out of Project V funding. So just want to frame that discussion for you. Also, moving on, we have the Pacific Electric right-of-way. This is a corridor that I wanted to highlight for everybody today, but this is a corridor that reaches all the way from LA County, right near the green line where the 710 meets the 105. And it goes southeast all the way towards central Santa Ana. And so this was a remnant of the previous the red car rail lines between Santa Ana and downtown LA. Now, over the years, of course, the red car declined in ridership. Many of you have heard these stories, especially as it regards LA County, but it was eventually closed. The last car ran on Pacific Electric right-of-way in 1958. It's now owned by OCTA, and this was an opportunity for OCTA and other jurisdictions, other regional agencies to propose rail along this corridor. But just like you had with the center line, there were some issues regarding residents' uneasiness of having rail in their backyard and having you know, access that wasn't in the name of a freeway system. So there were some issues with that. I'll leave that to your interpretation on why this corridor has not been developed, but I'll let you know that you probably have heard that LA County Metro Transportation Authority, they are developing this corridor on the LA County side of things. So they're developing a West Santa Ana branch rail line that's supposed to go all the way to the county line. OCTA was initially invited to coordinate and plan a rail line going straight from downtown LA all the way to Santa Ana to replicate what was the previous Pacific Electric right-of-way. And as far as we know, as far as what's been heard, OCTA has declined to partner with LA Metro regarding this rail line. But OCTA has provided funds for constructing a rail line in the central area of Santa Ana. As you can see, where the rail line ends, between where the rail line ends and where that yellow dot is by Santa Ana Regional Transportation. That's the area where OCTA is going to do rail. They're not, as far as we know right now, they're not considering rail throughout the rest of that red line through Orange County. So there may be some political reasons why. They own the corridor, so it's not like it's a right-of-way issue. There is another issue there that is not being discussed. I'll leave that to your interpretation. So in the future, and you know, again, going back to the flip side of the coin, you know, freeways have had a lot of impact on transportation in Orange County, and a lot of it has opened up the ability for people to have mobility. But then on the flip side of the coin, it's had a lot of displacement, a lot of impacts on lower income communities, especially Black and Brown communities. So what are we doing as a region to try and improve our transportation facilities or transportation scenario? A lot of it is focused on non-motorized transportation. multimodal transportation, increasing walking, increasing biking, increasing transit access, and improving air quality. These are all things that are, we think of, especially planners, we think of those as great things in terms of mobility and creating less impact, less footprint on the environment. But there is also a flip side to these things as well. We know that bike lanes, especially as Manny had mentioned on Bristol Street, that has caused some displacement, not only Bristol, but some areas other than that as well. And so we bring in the other issues, the flip side of the coin, displacement and gentrification, and how do we address those as planners, as we work with our partners, and how do we create a better future for Orange County, knowing what has happened in the past. I think that's how we should be framing the discussion today. And I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it along back to Chris, and we'll go ahead and get started with the robust discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Marlon. Appreciate tying that together. So we heard from different areas. I think there's some common threads. It felt like there's who are we actually doing these work for, the kind of community engagement aspect, but also appreciating the history of communities of these projects. I think history really does what history we even look at and actually uplift is something that I think as planners also dictate how and who we actually engage with. So I think even history has a huge role in how we actually should be looking at our communities and how we should be engaging with folks. So I definitely appreciate everybody for sharing. So I guess the first question to kind of kick off this Q&A, like I said, anybody that wants to drop a question into the question box, please do so. We'll be answering a couple questions. But to kind of kick off this portion, just wanted to kind of start off open question to whoever wants to take it on. So, as planners, this is a APA event, so we would definitely want to communicate to the planners out there. We have a lot of this history. We laid this groundwork of how things are. I think one of the biggest questions that planners might have is, how do we start deconstructing these planning policies, and creating these strategies that really continue to hurt and destabilize communities of color. I think that next step of where do planners start going? We're going to be sharing a resource sheet, hopefully to help out with that as well too. So we'll be sharing that with folks and participants. But when I open it up, what should be on planners' minds as, if they want in actually being a part of this deconstruction and actually, taking a step to remedy some of these inequities.
I can start. I think, there is kind of like this conflict between, or kind of this contradiction between the things that we want to do and the nature of planning itself. I think there is a sentiment or feeling that like, oh, planning is so technical, like it's so technocratic, like we're objective beings, like, we're rational beings and this and that. And, it's all best practices, as someone in this panel said, Manny. But, we also have to recognize that we have to critique these things. Like we have to ask ourselves, like, is it just because it's technocratic, it means that it's objective, right? Are we truly looking at how this is going to affect marginalized groups? And I think there is kind of like this contradiction between how planning presents itself and how it's taught, and the things that we want to do, right? We have this like human need to right wrongs, but we're also told that planning is this technocratic thing and it has these rules and blah, blah, blah. And I think we have to deconstruct that. I think we have to critique the technocratic nature of urban planning, because urban planning has been technocratic for a while now. And as a person of color, I don't think these are best practices for me, right? Asking again, like, who are these best practices for? Is it for me? Is it for the panelists here? So I think deconstructing that and just take power, I think. I'm a junior planner. I'm not really in a position to say these things, but I think on the long run, I think it would necessitate taking power in these organizations and steering them in the right way. I'm also like super into power and like postmodern theory, so maybe that's my own bias. But yeah, I would say just claim the power that you deserve.
Yeah, I'd love to take a quick stab at this one. It really starts with this is my own personal opinion. I know other folks can disagree, but I believe that elected officials play a huge role in this. I did mention that as part of the sales tax, the self-help counties funding transportation improvements. These are done by, like I mentioned, boards of supervisors. And this is not just in Orange County, it's in LA County, San Diego County, Riverside County, San Bernardino County, any other county that you can probably think of in the state. So, and these are the people that are making the key transportation land use decisions that you see that are affecting us on a daily basis, whether it be, funding Metrolink, funding rail, funding bike ped things. And I want to even bring back some statewide legislation such as SB 743, as many planners know, and as well as, in terms of increasing how we evaluate transportation, impacts and proposals, in terms of, we're not talking about level service anymore. We're always talking now about vehicle miles traveled. This wasn't done just by the people. There was an elected official that submitted legislation that got approved by state legislature. I'm just giving that quick example. My thought is that, if we were to have elected officials that are champions, that really care about these issues, that's what's really going to help drive the conversation in a positive manner. And so I would encourage everybody that's listening to really, talk with locals, your local electeds, make sure that the people that you share interests with get elected and are doing the right thing. So that's what I would recommend in terms of how do we change, go with the policy.
Yeah, and definitely to echo Marlon, I guess if you want to be really bold about it, or just you roll in some dice, you could quit your planning job and try to run for the city and agency whose plans you disagree with. But that's a whole nother story there. And really, I think, though, on a more serious note, is that I think as you look at the history of urbanization and planning policy, I think we do need to take a step back at every single kind of policy that we've inherited and take a look at it from fresh eyes and really examining what those impacts are. Because as Marlon really emphasized, it's going to be positive and negative. There's going to be trade-offs there, and it's not just about talking to the same groups of kind of people that are always involved in these decisions, but really finding ways to broaden that out. I'm kind of honestly just a really big fan of scientific surveys, something where you actually do survey a statistically valid sampling of the people that are in your residence rather than waiting for people to show up. I think one of the biggest mistakes that OCTA made when it came to the creation of the new line was that they had people that were paid, to do outreach, but were basically showing up to the same community events that everybody shows up to, and it's always the same people, rather than just sending them door to door to do a actual like survey of the people that were going to be directly impacted. And at that point, you would have really, like, early on in the outreach process, have identified that the main issue with OCTA's expansion of the OC streetcar was that people felt that there was no destination to get through. It might have helped out with some of the messaging to say, look, eventually we want to create a system. So from even just a project completion basis, that would have been good for them, good practice. But also you would have identified the fact that people were really worried about not being able to pay rent during the construction period, and money could have been allocated to actually meet the needs without as much displacement. So it's a different approach. And again, it's more on that door-to-door basis and going out to people rather than, oh, hey, we set up a table, look at all these photos that I have with like certain elected officials and we're at this table together, great. It's actually, sometimes it's, again, I think the word that we're hearing more and more about is it's performative, and it's not actual material changes to the policy.
I think just to echo what other folks have said and uplift ways in which planners might look to what's evolved in terms of government to government engagement with tribal nations as a mechanism or example for a better way to engage with communities to overall create better plans that's not rooted in white supremacist settler colonial culture. And by that, I mean tribal consultation practices are about building relationships. It's about understanding that this is intergenerational, and it's about building those meaningful relationships and recognizing that planning can't be done in a vacuum. And so I think those principles, you know, while there's a distinction, as I said, when it comes to sovereign nations, those principles are valuable overall. And ultimately, what a lot of the issues that were raised in racist planning practices throughout the course of this talk, you know, illustrate is that there's not been positive relationships. And so just uplifting the importance of building relationships and actual community engagement on community terms, not in some rote way that people learned in planning school, but what actually works for community. And I think it's especially important to uplift that during this global pandemic. I mean, you know, our organization has participated in several meetings where we've just been aghast at agencies going on as business as usual, you know, and we've had to say, COVID, you know, impacting our communities, communities of color, EJ communities, you know, far more significantly than other folks. And you cannot just continue with some planning process as if that's not a reality. So that's just one very real way that that's happening recently.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, you know, for learning lessons in terms of anybody that doesn't know, like, oh, you know, like I have my deadlines I need to meet. I need to make sure our grants are getting done. You know, I think there's that pause that you need to take as well too. I don't want to put too much on the spot, but like even in this panel, you know, Angela had reached out to us to actually make sure that we had Indigenous voices represented in this, and we stopped and made sure to at least include them in this panel and to incorporate them. And thing is, that easily could have been a deadline thing, like, but thing is we needed to also acknowledge that we also have limitations in our knowledge base, and we need to keep on learning and keep on growing our knowledge base, and not be afraid that you also don't know what you're doing sometimes and don't know the communities you're working with, and actually really listen to people. So I thank you, Angela, as well too, for calling us out on our lack of Indigenous representation in this panel and joining us as well too. I wanted to just, kick it over to Leila if she's has some questions lined up for us.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for everybody on the call and all the panelists. I see that we have about 7 questions, and I know we won't be able to get to all of them, but we have one question that's got 8 likes. So I'd like to, I think anybody that wants to answer this question is coming from Isaac. And is it possible to bridge the YIMBY Yes in My Backyard movement with activism? And how can the YIMBY movement avoid reproducing inequality?
All right, so if I may on this one, it just, I thought it was an interesting question. And I think that it's a valid one, because I think my initial critique of the YIMBY movement was that it felt like it was producing a lot of the same spatial inequalities, where we were basically protecting these single-family residential homes in the wealthiest parts of the county, the wealthiest parts of the country, right? So no one was like doing there was YIMBY movement for Marin, right? But, you know, it was like going anywhere so much as like, okay, we're going to be able to build in the Mission, or you know, down here it's like we're building a lot of housing in Santa Ana and Anaheim, but not so much in South County. So what I see, at least from a very practical standpoint, is if the YIMBY movement is really interested in structural change in the city, in the region and at the state level, with the with the passage of the revisions to the state planning code that now allow essentially so junior ADUs and regular accessory dwelling units on a property, you know, an effective triplex in some sense, not a full triplex, which would be even better. What is a big and open question is whether or not HOAs have the power to restrict and whether or not people are basically going to be able to build in these HOA protected communities in keeping with state law. And that's a lawsuit waiting to happen. No one's going to start that development until that lawsuit is settled, and that thing kind of needs to go through the courts, work out what the legalities are, what the restrictions actually are going to be, and come up with a ruling. But that's going to cost a lot of money. And if I'm a developer doing small scale triplex units, I'm going to avoid all that and just go to the communities that don't have HOAs. So if the YIMBY movement is really interested and has some funding in order to kind of challenge spatial inequality, I would start there because it's a very practical thing that needs to happen. And I think would be one of the organizations potentially to have the resources to carry it all the way up to the state Supreme Court to get a ruling that then would allow essentially ADUs and junior ADUs in these otherwise exclusive communities. So I would say tackle that area because that really needs to get done.
Would anybody else like to respond to this question or respond to Manny?
You know, I just want to provide some quick response to that because, you know, I definitely believe that community groups have a big part to play. And if you are able to gather the support that you really want for YIMBY types of issues, right? And not just for YIMBY, but for transportation in general and for my own perspective. You know, I don't think as planners, we do the best job at coordinating with local groups. And there's many instances where, you know, there are groups identified in certain communities that planners have not, and I use planners, but other folks that planners coordinate with, you know, for projects don't reach out and don't make that connection. And, you know, that ends up having a detriment to, you know, projects that are being developed that can be positive for the community. So, you know, just making sure that you're identifying which community-based organizations are in the area that you're thinking about and making that connection with them. How does it benefit them? And really taking your message, whatever that you're trying to come across with, to a place that's most convenient for them. You can't dictate the time and the place that you want to have your coordination. You got to go to where is most convenient for the community. So I would just want to reiterate that for all planners, that especially, you know, YIMBY groups that, you know, hold a lot of things that they want to do as well. You got to connect with the community-based organizations to really have that impact that you're looking for.
About 1 o'clock now. I'm gonna show the link to the AICP CM credit. I don't know if we want to stay on for about 5 more minutes. We've got about 9 more questions in the Q&A, but some of them I think will be great in the resource document that we're trying to get together for everybody that is here today to probably send out in about 2 weeks, I would say. So some of the questions like, let's look at it. There was a question on the Orange County Centerline project, and there's also a question for Manny about some of the resources they talked about today. I think that would be perfect to send out to everybody. Let me share my screen. So everybody can see that. So of course, if you're AICP, then you can get credit. This has been recorded and will be available to re-watch if you didn't have a chance to watch today. And so let me ask one more question. I think that would be
a broad question that may not have an answer. How, I guess speaking as a planner, do I, as an environmental planning consultant, help to combat inequities in land use planning? I often feel like I don't have a say in the project proposals we seek, or don't have as much of a say as I am not a regulatory approval entity.
So I can go ahead if no one else wants this one.
I'll go after you, yeah.
Okay. No, because it is one of the tougher ones, and I think it goes to the extent that, you know, us as planners, we live in different silos of this world, and, you know, some of us do a little bit more long-term planning and are looking at like long-term visions for areas, and then, but being on a project-by-project basis, that makes it much more difficult. And for me, I think the kind of main consideration there is really dependent upon the type of projects that you're being asked to consult on. And I would just say though, no matter kind of what that type of particular project is, that you want to provide as much information on the on the various impacts of doing or not doing projects. So I know that sometimes the EIRs can be very dry and boring, and like if you're an environmental consultant, formulating the basic data and information that goes into those EIRs, I think that providing best practices and as much information within that framework would be helpful, because oftentimes I think well, at least what I see is that information is there, but it's not necessarily as accessible, right? Once the document reaches the 5-figure mark and you're looking at multiple like thousands of pages, to have some way to really have racially disproportionate impacts more easily accessible, or at least the section on these are the potential negative effects of doing or not doing a particular action. I think that transparency really goes a long way, especially in the sense of impacting the regulatory agencies themselves, because at the end of the day, the average elected official and even the average appointed person to a regulatory body is not a planner, right? By training, they are individuals that were either in the political arena or were kind of learning on the job and maybe kind of specialized in a particular area and got assigned over. But it's much more time consuming to be able to kind of really look for all this information. So if you can make it as simple as possible to access it, that's what I would say. Again, more of an information access problem rather than learning the technical aspect of it. It really seems to be much more of a barrier there. But that's, again, my perspective from reading EIRs and trying to find the information that I'm looking for.
I would say if I was to put my environmental planner hat on, what I would say, the question, I don't think it necessarily differentiates between whether it's part of a project or not. But if you have a project that that's going to happen, and you're an environmental planner and you have something to do, or you have access to the details regarding the project, one of the things that you can do is to share those potential impacts. If you think that there's significant impacts to the community, share it with your community-based organizations. Maybe not put your name on it to, protect your own job and whatnot, but you can always share that information with community-based organizations. Having information is the first step of taking action and holding power in the community. So if you're able to provide the information that you know about that the community may not know about, I think you're doing a good thing by doing that. So there are tools that you can use. Sharing of information is definitely one of them.
We'll take one more question if everybody's available. We got 4 likes on this one from Christina Martinez. In transportation planning consulting, I feel that meaningful work we are able to do and influence is often limited by budgets and schedules. Are there examples of better best practices that we can implement to combat this in structure of our planning projects from the consulting side? Sorry about that. That's kind of a similar question to the environmental planning question, I think. Would anybody like to add to that?
I'll touch on Christina's question. It's not an easy one. It's definitely not. Part of the reason why I don't work in private, probably. But it's one of those things where if you're limited by cost, scope, schedule, you're limiting your impact or your involvement with the local community. That there's not much way around that. I mean, I think the only way around that would be to do pro bono work on behalf of the community, in terms of making sure you understand the issues and making sure that you give the appropriate time for the community to process that and propose actions as a collective. That type of thing doesn't necessarily jive with the cost, scope, schedule of a project. So unfortunately, that's not the best answer to it, but you may have to work outside of that framework to get the, to get the results that you want in terms of community involvement.
I'll just chime in a little bit on that one. Only I think in terms of best practices, kind of institutionalizing a CBO collaboration as well too. Yeah, a lot of CBOs in LA have been hired to participate in planning processes. SAS has as well too, and Latino Health Access as well too, and actually leading projects. So I think also even just different kind of partnerships help to alleviate that. So I know that Latino Health Access actually even helped lead the outreach in the active transportation plan in Santa Ana. So there's a lot of knowledge base in CBOs, but you also need to put a little bit of time also training those folks up to speak the planning language. So but there is a lot of payoff in actually building those relationships with community-based organizations. So I would say it's institutionalizing that and actually prioritizing them as an equal partner, because I think that even helps to help the budget and also even help in the schedule as well too, because they already have those connections in those communities. Not every community has them, but I'd say that you have to get creative, like who your partners will be.
All of these questions are really good. I want to take this last one from Lucinda. Why are community members not brought into the pre-development stage of planning, especially in older communities where there is possible gentrification?
So I can take that, if only for the sheer fact that I believe that this is Lucy from Artesia Pilar, and so thank you for being on. And specifically to her area in kind of the central core, at least what I'd seen is, and at least for my time in government and local government, is we're really bad at marketing. We're really bad at getting the word out in creative ways, because you're somewhat limited by the ways that you can do it, whether it's staff time, whether it's kind of just the approval process to get information out to community members. So there's that very kind of just a resource basis, why it doesn't happen as often as we don't proactively go out there. There's also, I think, kind of tied to that is maybe it was some of the statement earlier that we try to do these things that look like public outreach that don't necessarily get people that are outside of those circles, right? It's like this very traditional notion of public outreach. And I think that we're starting to move away from that, and you're seeing other examples of being able to do that. And then I guess third is that there is, I would say, at least some sense of not wanting to kick a hornet's nest because you're not really sure what these potential impacts are going to be. And there's a little bit of fear there, I think. That's, how do I say this? For anyone that's ever watched Parks and Recreation and has actually been on the other side of the panel being yelled at, it's not the nicest feeling in the world. It's a very scary feeling actually when you're being yelled at because you're just trying to do the right thing. But I think that, part of the professional job is to be able to take that criticism, understand what those feelings are, and then transform them, those that input into a positive reaction, right? So that's, I think, is what part of the job for planners should be. I don't necessarily know that it is on a day-to-day practice because a lot of us like to plan from our offices because it's nice and we get to look at maps and the codes all kind of make sense to us, and we just consult with our friends and our colleagues in various state agencies, and we have the inside track. But the challenge there is how do you connect that with community members? And I guess, the things I spoke about initially were all kind of from the planning side, but then also in a lot of these communities, there's just a limited bandwidth, right? And I think that that is much more difficult to overcome. There's a large extent to which the system that we live in has people working 2 jobs, raising kids, trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And when you're in that survival mode, it's much harder to actively participate in these conversations. And that's a much broader question and challenge than just the planning world. That's a completely systemic issue that we need to deal with as a society.
Awesome. We're at about 1:13. I think we'll just wrap it up. Does anybody have some final words or anything else they'd like to say?
Well, just quickly, just want to thank everybody for joining the discussion. I know we're at a limited time that we have, but there's a lot that we would be able to discuss. Maybe we'll do another webinar, but I hope that people had something that they took with them today and really understand the framework for how we can plan, at least start to plan for change in Orange County. Some of the things that you can do as an individual and to take back with you and start, being the change that you want to see in your own community.
I'd say connect with some local organizations. We'll share those in the resource, but Santa Ana Streets, we're advocating in the county level, state level. If you wanted to actually have more feedback on even just planning budgets and schedules and how it actually hinders community engagement, I think that's something that we can definitely help support because we are community engagement focused. Latino Taxis has been doing a lot of great work locally. Kane Commission has done a lot of great work in housing. There's a lot of different CBOs out there doing a lot of great work right now. And I think they know community engagement and they're definitely great partners to have. Nationally, there's been a lot of great movement with the untokening. We'll share some guides on even just COVID response and how, on the racial lens around that. The Safe Routes to School just took out the E in enforcement in their E's in their of traffic safety of the 5 E, the 6 E's. Now it's 5 E's. So there's a lot of different kind of concepts right now that are being talked about to educate ourselves. But I think this hopefully has just been a learning moment for everybody to just know our history, to also know that even though we have our deadlines, there's still people's lives at stake in all of this. And as planners, as community engagement folks, we are public servants to them. So I think just at the core of it, as planners, I think hopefully this is also just a reminder of who you're planning for. And I know you're always going to have your schedules, always going to have your budgets, but never forget the people that you're working for. So. Well, I guess it seems like everybody's saying goodbye, so I'll just wrap it up. Thanks everybody for participating. Thanks everybody for joining on today's call or today's webinar. We'll follow up with some additional resources and check out the recording later when we post it up. So thank you everybody so much for your time, and we hope to see everybody soon.
Thanks so much.